Hello and welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kaveh Takwai. In this week's episode, we will look closely at the U.S. organization USAID. Now, I always thought it was pronounced USAid, but it turns out it's USAID. Anyways, the U.S. has said foreign assistance is at the center of the most comprehensive reformulation of this nation's strategic doctrines in more than half a century, hence why USAID was formed. Well, the purpose then of the USAID, what it has said, their definition, foreign economic development around the world. But why is the U.S. so keen on giving support and funds to countries around the world? That is one of the key questions that we're going to be covering in this program. We're going to be looking exactly at the role that private business plays in USAID calculations and functions and why that is important to them. Our first report, a brief look at USAID, when and why it was formed, what its stated purpose is, and where the lines got blurred between aid and U.S. foreign policy objectives. It's a catchy commercial. USAID. Its stated aim. The purpose of foreign aid is to end the need for its existence. Yet, there's a dark side to this organization. The history of foreign aid in the U.S. goes back to what's called the Marshall Plan and the Point 4 program. The Marshall Plan, passed in 1948, was a foreign aid initiative aimed at rebuilding Western Europe after World War II. This paved the way for U.S. private sector investment in Europe. It was meant to remove trade barriers and open the European market to U.S. goods. The Point 4 program had two goals: creating markets for the U.S. by reducing poverty, by helping countries prosper under capitalism. Notice how reducing poverty and helping countries became byproducts of achieving the other goals, namely creating free markets and to prosper under capitalism. Then in 1961, USAID was born. Foreign economic development was its purpose around the world. Then U.S. President John F. Kennedy said the U.S. had a moral obligation, an economic obligation, and a political obligation as the wise leader of nations.
The phrase foreign aid is most often used, and I don't like the phrase because it sounds paternalistic. It sounds as though we're doing something for someone else, when the phrase that I like to use is development cooperation. Because if you're going to achieve results in development, no matter what sector you're talking about in a society, whether it's education or agriculture or the environment, it's the people in that country that have to succeed if a donor agency is to succeed.
Our studio guest for this section is UN representative from the Schiller Institute, Richard Black. He is also a writer, most notably his piece on China's 14th five-year plan, Science, Driver, and Culture, Not Money, Ignite Progress. Okay, Richard, according to records, first of all, welcome to the program, but according to the records, the U.S. is by far the largest donor when it comes to global health and development programs around the world. Leaders in Washington actually leverage billions of dollars in aid in their help to various governments around the world, low and middle income countries mainly. What are U.S. intentions behind all of this foreign aid?
Well, let me first say thank you, Kaveh, for inviting me and the Schiller Institute for this discussion today. This question that you bring up of intention is very important. The current intention is geopolitical advantage. But going back a bit, that is, to understand today, you have to know yesterday, President Roosevelt's intention was to end the wretched colonial system of the British Empire and all the other European major powers. And Roosevelt fought Churchill heavily on this. And this was also the intention to free the third world of imperialism. That was the intention of President Kennedy in his many initiatives then, in the early 60s, of technology transfer to the third world, the ending of U.S. troops in Vietnam, all these things that were attempted. Then Kennedy was assassinated, Robert Kennedy was assassinated, Reverend Martin Luther King assassinated, Malcolm X assassinated, all of these American intellectuals of stature. So I would say that the decay of USAID into a current British modeled geopolitical tool, a tool of the military-industrial complex, follow those British-directed assassinations. That's how we got here today. We have to go back a little bit in history. And they, List and Carey, defined a major role of big government, in not the private sector, in building great infrastructure internally. This idea, more advanced, has been revived by the American economist Lyndon LaRouche today. Now, the Russian Federation President Putin, he's recently called for a discussion of these kinds of questions among the superpowers, China, the US, Russia. He's called for this repeatedly at the UN Security Council. This in the midst of the pandemic and the famine. And in our opinion, President Putin is totally correct. In order to avoid a nuclear war in any region, including Southwest Asia, there has to be substantial negotiations among the superpowers. And if that were to be the case, then these solutions could be attained.
Okay, we appreciate that. That's Richard Black there, member of the Schiller Institute and representative at the UN for that institute. Now, many may outright reject any assertions that USAID is anything but aid and believe that the U.S. does have good intentions. But as you're about to see, the USAID program in Bolivia, Cuba, and in Ecuador was anything but that. Fans delighted as Beyoncé and Jay-Z visit Havana, Cuba.
Tenía muchas ganas de conocerla porque me encantan mucho sus canciones y estoy muy emocionada de que haya venido a Cuba.
Rap music popularity with Cubans is a reminder of how the U.S. government misused this in the not-too-distant past. This is the Cuban group Los Aldeanos, with lyrics like "This country is a prison" and a song titled "Rap is War." Los Aldeanos is not a group that one might expect to hear rapping in Cuba. Their inflammatory lyrics were enough to attract the U.S. government, which later funded a plan to use the group without their knowledge to spark a youth movement. The purpose? To undermine the Cuban government of Raúl and Fidel Castro. To spread that message, the U.S. government hired this man, music promoter Ratko Bozic, funded by the U.S. government through none other than USAid. According to documents obtained by Associated Press, Bozic was hired by a U.S. government contractor called Creative Associates. The contractor specialized in international development projects, funded by the U.S. taxpayer agency USAID.
They energize people and they convince people the change is possible. I think they did that.
So I think that they were exploited as a resource, they were used as a tool, and they've lost their authenticity.
In 2013, then Bolivian President Evo Morales expelled USAID from Bolivia. He accused the agency of seeking to undermine his government.
Y por eso, aprovechando esta concentración y el 1 de mayo, quiero informarles, hemos decidido expulsar a USAID de Bolivia. Se va a USAID de Bolivia. Pido al hermano canciller comunicar inmediatamente a la embajada de Estados Unidos. Nunca más USAID que va manipulando, que va utilizando a nuestros hermanos dirigentes.
The role that foreign aid plays in American foreign policy is basically to support a more stable and peaceful world. The way I see that role is that it prevents crises. If you invest in people in another country so that their society becomes more peaceful and stable and prosperous, you're going to prevent crises from happening.
Let's now welcome economic expert Dennis Speed. He's a veteran political organizer, a senior member at the LaRouche Political Action Committee, and he has worked at the development of the Fusion Energy Foundation. He's written extensively for Executive Intelligence Review. Dennis, welcome. Let's take a look at the year 2000. That's while the U.S. military was bombing Iraq and Afghanistan. USAID was tasked, as it stated, with rebuilding the two countries, with an eye, as it stated, to getting the most bang out of its funding allocations. But the lines between war development aid and corporate profit, well, they had started to blur, but also turned out to be a costly endeavor for both the U.S. And for Iraq. USAID is said to even be an enabler. Do war plans happen with this intention in mind?
Well, first of all, let me just reference, I realize this will be a reversed image, but there's a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman by a person by the name of John Perkins. This has been a disastrous American policy that actually goes back to the period of the early 70s, but then accelerated, as I said, after the year 2000. How it worked was the interface between private corporations and USAid. This began with companies like Bechtel, Halliburton. These were the defense contractors who actually began this policy under the Bush 41 administration between 1989 and 1992, early 93. Dick Cheney, who was then Secretary of Defense, is sort of the person that pioneered this policy at that time, privatizing the defense contracting and then interfacing this with the aid structure. So what happened was that whereas USAID, for example, back in the 60s, meant something positive, now what happened was that private corporations began to partner with the governmental structures, and they did this both in defense and in the form of development aid. What John Perkins talks about is how he, as a young man, was recruited to the intelligence agencies to do this. And so he would go in and try to get countries to commit to certain projects that were supposed to help them. Then the countries would become indebted in various ways. And as a result, they then had to allow American influence over their governmental structures. And it was always to their detriment. They usually were both indebted, and if they didn't listen, wars then ensued. So the war policy and the aid policy have become intermeshed, and this needs to be reversed as early as possible by the American people and the American government.
Okay, that's economic expert Dennis Speed. We're going to have him a little later in the program. Though we're about to take a short break here on Economic Divide, but don't go anywhere as we have plenty more coming up after these short messages, so stay right where you are. Hello and welcome to our Info News section, where we take a look at other economic news from around the world. Now, first up, we're going to take a look at the Americas and how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting that part of the world. Decades of inequality, neglect, and abuse are actually showing their ugly faces there. In terms of the consequences, it's a result of systemic inequality, widespread repression, and destructive policies that have now ravaged the country from the COVID-19 pandemic. Moving now to the U.S. tax evasion. It's tax time in the U.S. The richest 1% are dodging taxes on more than 1/5 of their income. That's quite a lot. That translates into the U.S. government being denied $175 billion a year in lost revenue, I should say. Next up, Palestinian Land Day has come by. 70+ years of Palestinian displacement is not something that can be ignored. And taking a look here, you can see this famous map of Palestine where the land keeps getting less and less due to the injustice that's being perpetrated against Palestinians by Israel. And finally, UK crime is costing the UK economy £36 billion increase in 5 years. And it has rocketed from £59 billion in the years 2015-16 to £95 billion in the last year. In 2012, the U.S. taxpayer-funded organization USAID was accused again of interference in another country's political affairs, this time by Russia. Russia, in turn, back then terminated the organization's operations in the country.
Характер работы представителей агентства в нашей стране далеко не всегда отвечал заявленным целям содействия развитию двустороннего гуманитарного сотрудничества. Речь идет о попытках влиять через распределение грантов на политические процессы, включая выборы различного уровня и институты гражданского общества.
Meanwhile, another instance of the U.S. provoking Russia came when former VP Dick Cheney visited Georgia in 2008. During this trip, he vowed U.S. support in the form of USAID to be spent on reconstruction and humanitarian aid in that country. This occurred after the Russia-Georgia war. Post-reconstruction contracts in U.S. wars was most prominent in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. More than 70 American companies and individuals, in one instance, won up to $8 billion in contracts for work in those countries. Not only were those companies donors to the presidential campaigns of George W. Bush for the year 2000, Bush's running mate that year, Dick Cheney, ran one of those companies, Kellogg, Brown & Root, the subsidiary of Halliburton. The report found that nearly every one of the 10 largest contracts awarded for Iraq and Afghanistan went to companies employing former high-ranking government officials or individuals that had close ties to those agencies or to Congress.
Can the Secretary of Defense, can the Vice President, can this administration take the military to war to feed the greed of contractors?
And where does USAID stand here? It was the organization which awarded the contracts to these conglomerates and Fortune 500 companies. USAID in Yemen, in Kashmir, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Which country is next?
What my mother used to say all the time is, why are we spending so much money overseas when we have all these problems at home? I often would testify before the Congress and start by saying that if I can convince my mother that this is important, then maybe I can convince you. It's not difficult to explain why humanitarian relief is important, because the American people, 80 to 90%, say yes, if people are suffering, we should help and save them, save their lives and make their lot better.
Let's welcome back Dennis Speed, economic expert. Dennis, in our final question to you, USAID's embrace of the private sector has set disastrous precedents over the years where the win of the private sector was often built on the losses of the people that it was supposed to help. Tell us what that exactly means.
Okay. Here's one of eyes over here. Okay. One of the companies that did that was Bechtel, for example. And it's important to note that George Shultz, who was very involved with Bechtel, now recently deceased, former Secretary of State of the United States, together with a couple of other individuals, enacted something in the early 2000s called a revolution in military affairs. It was an American revolution. It wasn't just technology like cyber warfare and all that kind of thing. It was a way in which you created a circumstance where warfare became a form of competition. There's a document that just came out in the United States called the Army and Military Competition Chief of Staff Paper number 2. And it says, war, in fact, is just one form of competition in a continuum of competitions. Military activities during competition can be defensive or offensive, lethal or non-lethal, etc. It goes on like that. It says war is a form of competition. First of all, that means you're not even trying to win a war. You're trying to perpetuate warfare. And what we're beginning, and we've been seeing this, it's really a British modeled perpetual warfare policy, which will be familiar to people that remember the period of the Persian-British wars of the 1840s or other such things back then, 56, 57, when in fact the border of present-day Iran was created by the British looting then Persia, and that's the kind of policy that, unfortunately, from the time of the Kuwait policy back in 1990-91 until this very day, that the United States has also elected to pursue a kind of Anglo-American self-destroying policy, and all imperial policies ultimately fail. You have had a problem with a shift in U.S. policy over the past 20 years, particularly since the year 2000. Prior to that time, at least there was a legacy of the earlier JFK approach to aid, which was at least an honest approach. But this then shifted, particularly at the time of the 9/11, post 9/11 era. So now what you have is a kind of combination of things, whether it's food as a weapon as a policy, in a different way, medicines as a weapon. It's not really entirely an American policy. It's a policy as a sort of more like a transatlantic world policy, first really initiated after the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the collapse of the Soviet Union in that period of 1989 to 91, when the neocons first came to power, the Project for a New American Century, and so on. And that outlook has shaped policy. You can see that outlook in people like Mike Pompeo, for example, who represented that. So it's been completely continuous from 1990, 91 under the George Bush 41 administration up until today. It's disastrous and is not working in the interest of the American people or the people that is apparently supposed to help.
All right, thank you very much for that. We appreciate it. That's economic expert Dennis Speed there. Well, it's time now to take a look at our final report in this week's program, where we take a look at two instances of U.S. interference, in this case against Russia, one that happened within Russia, and the other in Georgia, where former Vice President Dick Cheney actually visited Georgian troops while promising aid and democracy, U.S. style, to the country. It's time now for our in-depth section. First, imagine a poor country is recovering from a long war and struggling to meet the basic needs of its citizens. Now, the rich country steps up and offers to help the poor country. Rich country figures it's not just an ethical thing to do, but also a smart political move. Sounds good so far. But what if the way in which rich country helps the poor country is by partnering with the world's most powerful corporations to develop the war-torn nation? Well, in return for the corporation's apparent benevolence, rich country then uses this power to remove all the roadblocks the corporations might face in doing business in poor country. Now, the corporations are free to do business as they please, and, well, they make huge profits out of the resource-rich parts of poor country, and they even continue practices for which they would face criticism in the rich country. Well, this is while poor country continues to struggle to meet the basic needs of its citizens, except now it has the added burden of being indebted to the rich country and its corporations. So we ask, is this ethical? You're probably wondering who, after all, is getting helped in all of this. The whole theme of the topic of this show leaves one to think, what moral ground does the U.S. stand on? Or any country for that matter, which uses aid as a tool to help countries with aid to make a profit from the suffering of poor countries with profits of, in this case, U.S. corporations in mind, is just morally wrong. But morality does not play into U.S. politics. For example, there's nothing morally acceptable about U.S. sanctions when it is known to cause deaths, like right here in Iran. USAID's embrace of the private sector goes against the very moral premise on which it was founded. Helping corporations who have a dangerous history of using their power to twist the arms of government to the detriment of its citizens, it just shouldn't happen, especially if the countries that are suffering are due to the U.S. warmongering policies, and there are quite a few of those countries around. That does it for this edition of Economic Divide. We always welcome your questions, comments, ideas. Please do send them to us the old-fashioned way. Our email address is on your screens now. From Mika Vitagwe and the entire team, it's goodbye until the next program.